We have a number of the books from this series that are just coming off the press. One of them is the sense of the problematic of the disjunctions of church and people. That was a first basic project, the first step in this overall effort. Now from Eastern Europe, this is the 49th book, just from Central and Eastern Europe.
Wow.
And it's entitled The Spirit, the Cry of the World. And the Spirit, the Cry of the World. Also from Georgetown, the book Humanity at the Threshold. Humanity at the Threshold, especially about transhumanism and what its possibilities and limits might be. A book from New Jersey in the States on Romero, from the Hispanic community, very rightfully devoted to Archbishop Romero. And this is the first book in the series, The Church and People, Disjunctions in a Secular Age. Then there's a book that Ms. Hu did in-house, French Catholics and the Church, Pluralism and Deregulation. I think you're still working on a more final copy of this. This is something that Ms. Hu did in-house just the other day in order to bring that to us. I made a calculation the other day, and that is that in the office we had actually printed a desktop publication, 150,000 copies, 150,000 books, and sent them out to 350 libraries across the world, university libraries. So if you do a book, we will print it in this form here, and it will be available through Amazon and the general book publishers. We very much invite you to develop a study based on the cultures and inspiration of your people. God's Spirit in the World, another book by Vaclav Hrenovich of Poland, specialist in Eastern theologies and their spirituality. Faith and Secularization, a Romanian narrative, and Plural Spiritualities, North American Experience, Professor Schreiter, towards a canonic vision of authority in the Catholic Church, from Tony Carroll at Patron. A great book, Tony, congratulations. A Catholic minority church in a world of seekers. This is so hot off the press that I can hardly hold it. This is today or yesterday. It's just coming in, and the great the Spirit, the Cry of the World. So these books will be on display, and that's about half of the books that are actually in process by the teams in this particular project on secularity. And we have plans are to move from this project in the West to China and see what they can contribute to the understanding of spiritualities, and to Africa and Latin America. So this is the first jumping off, but there's a lot of work that's been done, and the model really works. And if you can convince your colleagues to come together and to go into their own culture and say, what does that create as difficulties and what does it create as opportunities, then it will be a missionary center that you'll have in action. So many, many thanks to all of you, and apologies for interrupting, but I wanted to introduce what these books are. They'll be on display outside so that you'll have a chance to look at them for the remainder of today and tomorrow. But they'll be able to be ordered through Amazon and the usual book stuff. And now we'll move to the second half of our project.
Thank you very much, George. I've been asked to chair this session. I'm Louis Caruana. As Dean of the Philosophy Faculty, I just take the opportunity to express my deep gratitude for your presence here. It's a great boost for our work in the Philosophy Faculty at the Gregorian. The official welcoming speech will be delivered by the Father Rector this afternoon. So that's enough. I've been asked to launch not this debate or deliberation, but a dialogue, with an emphasis on this word dialogue, in the sense that is marvelously explained by George in many conferences. So, as we have said, up to now we concentrated on disjunctions which are negative and which correspond to perhaps moments of darkness. In the good old Ignatian tradition, discernment is always in terms of trying to see the moments of darkness and the moments of light, problems and opportunities. So in the second half of our morning workshop, I invite you to reflect and share and dialogue about opportunities, moments of light in the present situation. And just to launch this, before perhaps passing the word to Professor Taylor about the buffer itself, which was the point mentioned before the break, I just stimulate your interest and your perhaps sharing this morning by mentioning what seemed to me some positive points in the present situation. Not everything is darkness. We have mentioned, for instance, a shift between persuasion in terms of reasons to persuasion in terms of trust, persuasion in terms of action, action that speaks louder than words. As an example, excuse my reference to my own religious order, we Jesuits, as you may know, have been active worldwide in what we call the JRS movement, Jesuit Refugee Service. And I think it is an example of how actions may in fact attract, persuade, consolidate trust, and so on. So it is an area which you may want to explore more. Another point that has been mentioned as a positive point is the Pope Francis effect. I invite you to ask, however, what is this effect? Can we pinpoint what makes a Pope John the 23rd and what makes a Pope Francis, so that we can learn more and perhaps stimulate these values or these impressive character traits and learn. And the final point, which may be obvious to many of you, is that there are some pastoral experiments that have been quite positive in the current situation. People engaged in pastoral life in the church have expressed interest in, for instance, a phenomenon, at least in Europe, of pilgrimages for youth. It seems to be producing new energy. Another opportunity, perhaps, is online interaction. Weirdly, well, I'm not the Facebook generation, I'm afraid. Younger people are certainly members of the Facebook generation. Is that only a source of problems? Probably not. It could also be a source of opportunities. So, just to start us off, I have to hesitate and say something about the buffered self regarding the philosophy of the.
We're going to have discussions later on.
Okay. So we just launch the dialogue on any points, maybe some of those mentioned by me as well. Yes, Jim?
And just to begin and to follow up a little bit on what we were talking about before the break, conditions of trust. It's an interesting question how one would create the conditions of trust, but you just mentioned pilgrimages there. And yesterday Professor Hellemans and I were talking about the degree to which the Camino de Santiago attracts people today. And it seems to provide, once people get to it, from very diverse positions, it seems to provide conditions of trust and for exchange between people as they walk together. I'll give one quick example. One of the major superiors in my religious order, which is the same one as his, you know, he had a series of lofty positions in which he was father, and he was meeting prime ministers and archbishops and all sorts of people, and then he became John. And he decided to spend 2 months on the Camino. And he walked with people coming from every continent, all sorts of backgrounds, struggling with all sorts of issues, which, as they walked together in different small groups and met each day, you know, this is where they stayed at night and so on, they just had, I think of Habermas, a dialogue undominated, completely free in exchange, but without worrying about their moral backgrounds or their perfections or their allegiances or whether they were in or out of good relationship with the church or anybody else. And he said it was an extraordinary experience. And for him personally, you know, it brought some things too. And I think that it would be good, inductively maybe, to reflect on such examples and wonder, what are the conditions? And are they creatable or repeatable, under which we can actually bring forward the possibility that people coming from very diverse circumstances, whereby they would have been mutually threatening before, can actually begin to learn to live and walk and holistically dialogue together. And could we learn to create such conditions from such examples?
Thank you very much, Jim. So we have here the kind of desire to learn from such pastoral successes. If there are some questions related directly to this, you had something directly to this? Or something?
Mine is a little different.
So perhaps a direct reaction? Yes, thank you.
Yes. I work also in post-conflict reconstruction societies, and the kind of rule of thumb around recreating conditions of trust is you have to provide safety and you have to provide hospitality. Safety is for people, you know, who've been traumatized and so on, but you create an environment where they're not on their guard or have to be buffered, you know, in some kind of way. The hospitality, the key to that is hospitality is always culturally specific. So it's not the hospitality I know how to give, but the hospitality that makes sense to the person to whom I'm addressing it. And there's a deep theological thing behind that. Namely, trust, of course, is related to faith. And hospitality, of course, to Eucharist. And I think what we've seen, just to tie it to the Francis effect, the way he handles audiences. He gets out there, he doesn't wait for people to come to him. He goes often to the most vulnerable, you know, and puts them at ease. He's demonstrating this. His whole idea of the mystica of encuentro is about that moving out to create those kinds of conditions. And so I think he's if you want an example, he's done that extraordinarily well. The way he's built friendships, you know, in interfaith situations, you know, is another example. So I think there, you know, is something we could build on because it's something that is already being enacted in different sectors that are trying to rebuild trust.
Link to this?
Yes.
Yes,
Yes, I think also universities, I think, are places that could provide this kind of space. I think there is a problem, however, that most of our universities have been plagued with the problematic of the Catholic identity, and then we lose that characteristic of being a safe and open space for dialogue between different traditions. So I think there is both an obstacle and an opportunity there to seize before Catholic universities become self-monologous, shall we say.
Something else about hospitality and safety, yes, please.
Well, my comment links more, I think, with the issue of refugees and pilgrims and of the underlying theme of movement there. We were having some conversations recently in D.C. about some of the sources of theological ferment in the American church, and maybe one of the most creative sources there is the whole issue of migration in the United States and how the church is responding to the changing Latinization, largely which occurs through migration and refugee movements. And talking about this, it struck me that there are important parallels between the experience of migration and the experience of pilgrimages. They're both movements in different ways that bring new ideas and new life into the church. The underlying theme that struck me was that that has a link to the idea of dwellers and seekers and of stasis versus movement. So the idea that I'm playing with is from kinesis to kenosis, I guess. Movement,
Whoa.
sorry about that.
Thanks very much. Yes, was there much to say in this direction? Yes, please.
Just dialogue. You could make a case that a dialogue isn't just an exchange of information, so it's not just the content that is being passed between people, it's also how it's communicated.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also the who of the people who are communicating. And I think that that's a hugely important dimension, if you like, of witness, the way the person is there and holds himself or herself in relation to the other. The philosopher who's sometimes forgotten and neglected now is Martin Buber, and he's a marvelous person on that sense of personal encounter and how in that encounter itself something of the divine is communicated. But one of the questions that I have, however, is that for a dialogue, people must have something to say, in a sense. And some of the conditions of life in the West are such that, I talked about the lobotomy, spiritual lobotomy earlier, but one senses sometimes that people don't have the words, they don't know how to word what is most deep and intimate in relation to things religious or non-religious. There's a kind of an autism, so to say. We're driven into a kind of autism of the spirit. And when a situation like that obtains, we can have a dialogue because we're highly sophisticated in terms of education and so on, but there are so many people who are, there are no words that they have to communicate, and sometimes then the witness, I think part of the power of the witness of Francis is precisely, it's like a performance art. He does something, it's an art which performs agape generosity, let's say. But how do we deal with that kind of an alphabetism of the spirit, which certainly in the West, I have students from China, from Japan, from Africa, from India, and strangely enough, they don't have the sense of self-consciousness that prevents them from speaking what is in their heart. Whereas my Western students, they're also hyper self-conscious that they're afraid to expose themselves if in fact they do have deeper senses of something at stake here.
Thanks, yes. Just links up very nicely with, I think, what Jim has contributed, because it seems that when we have, for instance, a pilgrimage, it could be an occasion for growth in dialogue, as you know, we're walking together or engaged in some kind of common project, and that is where people can start talking. Otherwise, if you tell them let's dialogue, it seems to be too abstract.
Can I speak to that?
Yes, please. There are some people just.
Okay. Just on that particular topic, the question is, how do you express the apophatic? Not easily, but we do have some experience, and one of the last things that Mrs. Hu did in her life was to provide Hu Yeping with a house, and rather than having catered meals, who gets the food, and the people cook the food. It's in this situation that the barriers break down, and the continuation of the morning seminar is carried on. And the morning seminar these last 3 years has been directed by Father Vila-Chã, who opens the issues for them to the degree that that can be done with words. But when you can't use words, use actions.
Thanks.
Just to continue the search for pastoral experiments that have worked. Part of my life is lived in a parish, and one of the things that is now very popular among young people and not so young is the turn to mindfulness. And there you get together both seekers and dwellers in a condition of trust. And the sound of silence within mindfulness is very, very powerful, and the levels of trust are very significant. But when you get into that, it raises very deep questions about levels of consciousness and interiority, and what is going on inside our identities, and what is it that people are seeking to understand. And there is a tradition, a very rich tradition, across the religions in that whole area of mindfulness or meditation or being together in silence. And it seems to me that there is a very significant opening there, and it's almost now a countercultural sign to a world that is so noisy and so kind of clashing of sounds, of empty sounds, but there's something very significant there. And I think it brings us back yet again, if you'll forgive me for repeating myself, to the question of anthropology and the human self. What is going on in the human self when there is mindfulness taking place? And I think that does open horizons.
Thanks very much. This has opened up a new area, which I think, at least from what I was thinking our line of dialogue was, because now we have the introduction of, as it were, encouraging or sustaining dialogue by being together in silence. The opposite view, which I think was dominating the previous exchange, was to encourage dialogue by doing something together. Of course, doing something together, like praying together or being mindful together, is also doing something, but it's of a different kind. My original understanding of our exchange was to pass from dialogos to diapraxis, using an expression used recently by Peter Balais, who was in charge of the Jesuit refugee service. So diapraxis, doing something together, walking to Compostela, or helping the poor, could in fact get us in a situation where we can exchange. But there are other models, as you say. You can also perhaps get together and engage in reflection or meditation. Some Spirossi, I think you want to engage in a new direction?
Well, actually, at least you know, now, given the way the conversation has gone, what I'd like to do is suggest a dimension of what's already been discussed, or you know, basically introduce another theological term that I think would be important for you know, thinking and reflecting at, which is, it seems to me that in everything that we've talked about so far, one of the other things, or what is involved also, can be spoken of in terms of the language of grace. And it seems to me, talking, framing this question of both the doing and the talking and the reflection, to be attentive to be attentive to the fact that what is going on is grace, not in the sense of a thing, but in the sense of how what is done is being done. And it seems to me that for instance, hospitality is very significant as a modality of grace, precisely in terms of how it is done, being attentive, and it's also reciprocal. That good hospitality is not just simply being a good host, but it's being a good guest. And being attentive to those kinds of things, I think, are again creating. It's in that it's both the conditions of trust, but it's also an enactment of the trust. And in some cases, the trust is only going to come about precisely by taking the risk of enactment. And so I think one of the questions, in terms of the practices of the church, is, are we willing to take the risk of being gracious? Are we willing to take the risk of the graciousness that's involved in listening, in discerning, in serving?
There's Dennis.
In line with this place for dialogue, I like, we already mentioned that pilgrimage of the movement, another space as mentioned as a university. But I also like to add a battlefield, the term that borrowed from the Pope Francis, the hospital of the battlefield. So battlefield where the people are wounded and struggling very seriously. So as we know, the refugee case is a very serious one. But coming from Korea, and I'm a Jesuit sociologist, so bringing all these backgrounds, the church has been rapidly grown in Korea, whereas whole the universal church invested a lot in Japan and China, but not much. Korea has been more or less ignored. Small country. But church grows. Why? In my view, the church has grown because the church, the Catholic Church, participated in the battlefield of the whole Korean society for the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. So I'm not talking just about this apologetic growth of the church, but where can we earn the trust or the credibility? When the people see the church, the Christians are on the side of the people who are suffering. I think that's why the Pope Francis is on the great credibility. So I like to add, so in our conversation, when we say the dialogue, this kind of academic dialogue, we are sitting here. But if we have a dialogue on the field battleground, when the Syria, like the Ukraine war, then our conversation becomes very rapidly changed. So that's one of the space as for dialogue. And then another one is, so that is related, so as the first question about the persuasion by reasoning or persuasion by action or that kind of things. Then another one that is I like to make, the point is that, because I appreciate your bringing the persuasion by reasoning. I think the Catholic Church has emphasized very much the truth. But some years ago, I heard a very interesting, not official interpretation that for the superior general of the society, Jesus, that he said. Jesus said that I am the way, the truth, and the life. In his view, he has been a missionary in Japan for many decades. So in his view, here in the West, we emphasize very much the Jesus as truth. But his experience in Asia, Jesus as way. And after he became a superior general, he came to learn more about Africa. And then he found Jesus as a life. So the church needs to be more enriched by all these diverse aspects the local church are bringing to. In a sense that his description, some might say that a very more simplistic perspective, but in a sense that I have that there might be something in it. So that's what I can believe.
Thanks. Just to clarify, at least to me, when you mentioned the battlefields in Korea in the 60s, 70s, 80s, what were you referring to exactly? Was it youth movements or drugs? Or?
That's most sort of the post-colonial society has task, in a sense, the economic development and the political democratization. And the third one would be like the fighting human rights or the human, guaranteeing the human dignity and human rights, something like that. So that would be, I would say, the historical task of the post-colonial society. So church, Korean church, under the leadership of Cardinal Kim, who passed away, he didn't make that many direct evangelization, but he has been present and for those who are wounded, for those who are marginalized. For example, the urban poors or the emerging, the working class. So church participated in this sort of the battlefield or historical task. So if I say further than that, that's another big question. But so what is important to how we name our times? So for Cardinal Kim, he thinks that his time, this participation of this, guaranteeing the human rights and the democratization is important in his time. But the current situation would be different. So if we say that our time is a secular age, which I think that's very much manifested the experience of the church in the West, perhaps in the Europe. But a church in Asia, even in Japan, I cannot say it's a secular, they are living in a secularism. Even the Christianity is less than 1%, or even in Korea, for those people who identify themselves as Buddhism or Protestant or Catholic are less than half, 50%. They identify themselves as no religious. But I cannot say I'm living in a secular age. So how do we name our times that really shape our directions?
Thank you very much. I think there's Lydia.
Thank you. I was very, very impressed by all the things that we have said, and in particular the last one about grace and the courage of being gracious. Sorry for my English.
Yeah.
And in particular, I want to speak about the courage of gaining grace, of being gainer of grace for us, by the personal point of view, and for all the others. And with this intention, I will think that an item very useful for our purposes is to redefine the concept of holiness. And not only by using it as a model, as a living model, but to fulfill it with something that is very human and very basic in the dialogue. For example, we talk about how to be trusted in dialogue. And I think that to be holy is one possible way and not as perfect, but with qualities that assure safety and hospitality. It's like safety and hospitality are consequences of being holy. I don't know if I and to understand this concept also because it is linked to the one key concept of Christianity, that is life is a pilgrimage. It's a walk towards an objective that is always seems to be transcendental. Okay, and if life is a pilgrimage, the way in which we walk together can be fulfilled with holiness as a way of behaving. It's like not to be violent. Very simple, very human, very simple. Not also religious, but it's like to be together with respect to all each other. I hope that I made clear my thought. Thank you very much.
Please.
Thank you. We are talking about genuine dialogue and gaining trust in dialogue. I think a very important dimension of that is whether the dialogue partner, let's think about a secular Czech seeker coming from the Czech Republic, whether that dialogue partner has the impression that, in fact, I, as a Christian, being humble and polite and listening, am still trying to convey my message, or trying to find more appropriate ways of getting the message across. Not necessarily a conceptualized, verbally articulated set of doctrines, but the reality of the gospel. Or, and that is an alternative, I think, whether I am actually opening all my certainties and all my commitments in this genuine encounter, which may actually end up in my own transformation, and in actually allowing that encounter to challenge my own certainties and so on. And I think in European secular context, this is very vital. Are we discussing a better methodology of getting the message across? And let's talk about the holistic understanding of the message, not just a set of doctrines, but the reality of the gospel, let's say. Or are we actually approaching dialogue as a genuine encounter, which may perhaps then be a new resource for theological reflection? In other words, is that a situation where we are opening ourselves to listen not just to the dialogue partner, but to perhaps God speaking to us through the mouth of the dialogue partner? And this is just one example, but it's also related methodologically to the idea whether we should look at the empirical data of sociological research as a theologically relevant, important resource, or just as something that is missiologically important for us to change the form of what we preach, but not the content, which we know is timeless. And I don't want to be provocative, but I think this is a very important key question which had to be addressed before we actually make the next step. So,
thank you. I suppose what we're dealing with here is the very nature of dialogue, isn't it? You're emphasizing, as I get it, the main point of being a dialogue, being a journey where both of us are engaged. And so we should be open to change, not just expecting the other to change. I think there's, yes,
just two small points. The first one is, we're talking about change, we're talking about openness. Openness to what? To what? Or to what type of experience, what type of vision, and openness to who, For instance, when I try to, we're talking about renewing the church from the point of view of secularization, you know, on these secular ages, whose question am I addressing? You know, I mean, I come from Cameroon, you know, an African country. Whose question am I addressing? Am I talking about issues pertaining to a given part of the church? Do I want to renew the church from, I mean, like issues which are connected to a given location, or is a sort of universal renewal that kind of integrate, you know, major issues that people are facing here and there? Just being suspicious. The second point is my own inner conversion, and maybe talking a bit from an Ignatian point of view as a Jesuit. Ignatius invite us to be in between, you know, bridge builder, meaning makers, but bridge builder. Should I, or I feel like I've been listening to people, listening to people, a call to move away from the I and the they language. You know, the we and the they, you know, talking about the church as an external reality. It's not my church, it's their church. Maybe it's the church of Canal so-and-so, or Pop so-and-so. Yet, we are making the church. I mean, this is how I see it, you know. We're making things happen, you know. I mean, like a sort of critical introspection, maybe even a call to invent a new language, new ways of naming things, things which are not out of my own realm, but which are part of who I am and what I'm called to become. So.
Thanks, Jack. You know, of course, we are here dealing with the deeper question also raised by Dennis Kim. The categories, the very categories we're using to talk about, what we want to talk about, can in fact be somewhat linked to one part of the world relevant to another. So how are we naming the age? How are we naming the church? And what are the implications of the very words we use? And we need to be aware of this, the deeper nuances, how these concepts relate to one another in our own conceptual scheme, so that we be aware of what's happening when we engage with somebody from another conceptual scheme. I think there is Joel.
Yes. Thank you. I think this is very interesting, the way it is going, and I loved, obviously, the reference to Martin Buber a moment ago. I think that one of the things that as intellectuals in the church, and seeing ourselves at the service of the church, and that means at the service of the human family, because this is what the church is about, not an end in itself, but a service. I would say an ontological service to the world, sent out to the margins, using the idiom of Pope Francis. I think one very important thing, and with that I want to go back to the anthropological issue, is what have we gained as we look back into our history? I think all great people that really made great contributions to the world, and of course I'm thinking as a would-be philosopher and someone who really believes that without philosophy we cannot move ahead, for a simple reason. And the reason is that we can have tremendously important and beautiful intuitions, but we need to articulate them. We need to put them together. We need to find ways of mediation, particularly in terms of language. For example, it was mentioned the issue of the social networks. I am convinced this is the single most important communicational event of the 21st century. The most important communicational event, even for the church. Now, we also know that the powers that are trying to overtake it. I mean, discussion at the super speed, not super speed, one tire, second tire, it will be a disaster if it happens. As it will be a disaster in the church if we go back, if we stay behind the achievements, for example, of Vatican II. And those achievements, I think, were in the first place philosophical achievements, even before they were theological ones. And again, I think the revolution that people like Martin Buber from Jewish, Jewish philosopher or Franz Rosenzweig and all the other people that were obviously on top of a long and deep and difficult process. I think they brought the human awareness to a level that we as Catholics, we as Christians, we cannot allow ourselves to go back. Because if we fall back from that, we are just being ignorant. We are just being maybe even irresponsible. I know that Professor Joas is very, very interested. I know I've read the book just arrived, but this whole issue with the axial age. I mean, this is a topic, well, Jasper's, the famous book and so on. I think this is very important to recognize. What is the axial age for us today in the church? And for me, the axial age, the way I understand it is there is a common denominator. There are that things, I mean, words, ideas, concepts, injunctions, imperatives, and so on and so forth, behind which we cannot fall. Because if we fall behind that, we are being unfaithful. We are just being out of reality. So I think you have a tremendous need to articulate those things. For example, in terms of a dialogical understanding of the human condition. In terms of understanding that there are ways of acting in work and in the church that do not respond to the status, I would say, to the axial age or to the axiality of the new age. I mean, sorry for the word, I don't want confusion. To the new age in which we entered, for example, with Vatican II. I think this is probably what I'm trying to say is, let's also look at our own conceptual framework or our conceptual frameworks and analyze and ask the question, am I operating in the best possible way in terms of concepts? I mean, as we look to the communicational structures today, I mean, engineers, what do engineers do? Well, they put things in, but things work. I mean, connections, hyperconnections, and so on and so forth. Why do we not, in the human sciences and in humanistic sciences, humanistic reflection, also take over this element that we really need to be very clear? So there is something, there are ideas, there are concepts, there are projections, there are whatever, even imaginations, that if we stay behind, we are really behind. And we are not up to the times, and we are failing into the injunction of interpreting the signs of the times. Mm-hmm. So my claim, in a way, is let's not leave behind the conceptual work, the philosophical work, the work of mediation that we need to do in order to create a true community of seekers, even if we are dwellers, or we think that we are dwellers. So that our proposal, might be understood outside of the circles in which we move.
Thank you very much. So, very rich contribution there. I think we have...
Yes, well, I'm a bit dizzy now. To go back to the idea of action and also battlefield hospital. I did some work with the military, so I'm somewhat familiar with the battlefield hospital. And I think there's more to the metaphor that we are sort of getting from it. It's not just about going out there to help the wounded. I think it's also about changing our view of the world and changing our attitudes, because being in a battle hospital, the ideal conditions are not there. So you got to do what you got to do with what you have. And I think the church, we as church, have lost this. We have lost our naturality about the world. So we're caught up in all kinds of structures and this ideal of perfection and purity, and so we can't function in a battle hospital. So we would be terribly inefficient and if we were sent to a battle hospital today. So we need to prioritize, we need to stabilize the patients, we need to improvise We need to have some kind of spiritual intelligence, that is to think outside the box, because there is no box. So I think that Pope Francis is also calling us to move away from the perfect hospital where the hygiene conditions are ideal and everything, where you have all the tools, where you have all the answers, basically, to go to a place where you don't have all that and you need to focus on reality as it shows up and not as if you'd like it to be. And so my point is, have we lost our ability to be in the world? This is a serious question for me. The other point I wanted to make about practice is the Good Samaritan. I really like that parable in the Bible. That what do I need to do to be part of the circle? Well, you don't need to know everything by heart or to do this or to do that, but you need to help the person who's wounded. So I think this is also a comment about the naturality. If you see somebody wounded, your own nature as a human being should compel you to help that person. So, and I think something has happened that we've lost this ability, and we go into all kinds of questioning modes. Should I help this person? How should I help them? And we lose this sense of urgency and practicality. So I urge ourselves for a call to action. And the church, what can we do to regain our sense of worldliness, to be in the world, efficient human beings in the world.
Thank you. There is, of course, a rather normative line in what you shared with us. But I appreciate also that you're highlighting what seems to be working well. So just to remind ourselves of the main area of our discussion in the second part of our workshop, we're really trying to focus on what works, the conjunctions. So whenever there is more, let's say, immediate engagement, as you're suggesting, kind of the Good Samaritan attitude, that's where things are working well. There are a number of people who I think...
I would like to briefly come back to the point that Professor Kim was making in reinforcing this point on the importance of finding right concepts and right articulation for the age we are living in, and it's really culturally and historically related. And sorry for bringing again Ukraine into the picture, but again, I see this point working really now in Ukraine. It's really will not make much sense to talk about the church in a secular age in Ukraine, but we just spoke about it. For example, now in Ukraine, the whole articulation goes around the question of dignity. So the revolution was called Revolution of Dignity, and now the public discourse is situated around the topics how to make a transition from the revolution of dignity to the country of dignity, to economy of dignity, to educational system of dignity, to politics of dignity. What this could mean, how dignity could be manifested. And in these circumstances, Church has tremendous opportunities to talk and to provide some answers to these questions. For example, now one of the threats and one of the appeals Church makes is really to connect, corruption, which is a big problem still in Ukraine, to the question that this is annihilation of dignity. If you want to be a society which is built around the dignity, so corruption shouldn't be present there. And another manifestation would be, for example, in the situation of war, there is a great risk that hatred becomes a motivational force for constructing different different areas of human life. And church really counteracts with this message, this appeal to the hatred as a source. So I think that each situation really is unique, and church has much opportunities to respond to the situation like unique.
Okay, I think we have one, then there's 2, 3, 4, and then perhaps I'll ask the people who are most engaged in this to react perhaps, and then because we need to wrap things up around 12:15. So let's go ahead. There's more time, of course. We have other questions.
Good. Thank you. I was going to inject a note of skepticism into the discussion, but I'll take your advisement seriously and something positive out of it. But the note of skepticism is with the Francis effect and how far that really goes, or whether it is more about style or substance or spirit rather than substance. One of the reasons that I ask this is because in this whole research approach that was originally formulated as the Disjunctions Project, our group in DC with Jose was the only group that tangled with the issue of morals and of moral change and historicity of moral teaching. I think there are probably a number of reasons for that, but my mind runs in that direction as we have this discussion, and the question becomes, sure, we can change the appearance of some of the things that the church is doing, we can change the tone, we can talk more about the spirit, but at some point, some of those questions about the truths that the church proclaims and whether they themselves are approached dialogically or in a spirit that is open to a kind of fundamental dialogue and fundamental, that becomes more of a pronounced question. And I'm not sure how far we've moved in that direction. I think some of the work that Jose has done, some of the other people in our group, looking at some of the questions related to sexual norms, to tolerance for different groups in society, those are some of the key questions there. But there are other aspects of that where, to pick up on Taras's remarks, the church's commitment to peacemaking, for example, really has shown some movement on those issues. And even now, there are further substantive changes, I think, that are bubbling up, having to do with nuclear disarmament, for example, that we're going to be hearing more about soon, that do show some hopeful signs, I think. But I'd like to hear if any of the others of you have reflections on changes at that level of deeper proclamations of truth that go along with the shift in focus to actions rather than words.
Thank you. Good question there.
I'd like to follow up on Chantal's remark, which I found extremely important in our context, when you said we've lost a sense of the world. But I think in addition, we've lost a sense of ourselves as well. We talked about this earlier on in the first part as well, the loss of the spiritual stuff. But if we focus on the title as well, we see a beautiful synthesis of two different kinds of metaphors, dialogue that focuses on language, on hearing, listening, speaking, and vision that focuses on our seeing. But of course, human beings do not just listen and speak and see. We taste, we're being touched, we have more senses than just those two. And when we talk about hospitals, we bring in the full human being. And maybe we need to focus on this as well. How do we integrate this again? How do we develop a more holistic anthropology? How do we focus on the human being, not just as a cognitive human being that understands, that listens, that speaks, that hears, or that has a vision? And I think some of the new changes that we talk about now focus on hospitality, focus on the hospital, going to the margins, focuses on this fuller sense of the self. And this requires a very different way of thinking. It needs to be not just dialogical, it needs to be more experiential. And I think, Joao, you mentioned Rosenzweig, and his focus is on experience, on historicity, on what we experience as human beings, and then maybe Christ saying, "I'm the truth, the way, and the life," it's not just a triangular structure of different concepts, but they're tautologies. You know, being the truth means being the way that opens up. You know, something opens up, clears, while we go this way, and this is experience as life. And then it maybe culminates in the concept of life. So what does life mean then? I think this may be crucial issues. And what does an incarnational anthropology mean then against this background? This may be one of the important issues.
Thank you very much.
Yes, among the silent times in my country, and in my experience of the religious life, Romania, yes, I like to speak about this situation. During the Mass each morning, I have no more than 30 persons, and on Facebook, I have more than 1,500 followers. Half of them attend the Mass on Sunday, but not during the week. So my question is, could we include seekers and dwellers, because I have among these fellows seekers, agnostic, not Catholic, Orthodox people, so on. Could find a new category, so to include seekers and dwellers. That is my question to Charles and Jose. How do you comment also this new church on network?
Just one more question, just to close his piece, and then we'll pass on to the panel.
Just a short comment. Thank you for this discussion. And during this discussion, I was thinking about how could we learn the kind of holistic dialogue. So I'm a sociologist, and let me give you a very short example. I was a member in a church community. The priest was Focolare, belonged to the Focolare movement, and he began 25 years ago to teach the members of the church how to speak with each other, how to act with each other, what would be the good role model. So it took 25 years, and I think we created quite a good community, and we believed everybody learned something which is very valuable and very useful, and something for ourselves. And now this year, this priest was changed. He had to go to another church, and we got a very, very traditional priest. and it was a shock during the first Mass, because when he began to speak to us, he just declared something, declared. And we used to, we wanted to answer, but nobody asked us. And one of my members of our church asked me, how can we teach him? and I was thinking about, are you so naive? Do you have another 25 years? So, and during this discussion, I was thinking about, it takes time. What we are talking about, it's very, very, it's fantastic and important for me, really. But even this is a very, very fast age, everything very fast, full of everything. But it takes time, so we can't change so fast. We can change, really. I have a hope, but it takes time. Probably 25 years. So it's a dialogue.
Okay, I think before we pass to the panel, and there's who would like to add something?
I want to say a few words. When we talk about the title, renewing the church, we talk about the church as institution. But if we think of the church as a community, as a family, what we call the Holy Father, at the beginning as a family, and then we might find some new concept, new ideas.
Dysfunctional
outside the
family.
box. And I remember the last year to visit the Continental culture, and you know, you have to pass the iron door, and it reminded me of China. Only the communist offices have the guard.
Yeah.
Just Professor mentioned, open to whom?
Thank you. Okay, now of course there are so many interesting things that have been said. Perhaps we can wrap things up by asking some comments from.
And then can we prioritize some of these issues that are coming up?
Go right ahead, John.
I used the term "we." But the things that stand out that feasible to work on and can be fruitful and follow through, can reach out to different parts of the world.
I can throw a few questions that are coming up. I mean, how, I guess we'll go back to the question about how do you put together in the church seekers and dwellers. But I think it needs two kinds of institution building, right? That we can't think of the, let's say, institutions operating in the church simply as alone parishes. Of course, fortunately, we all really have in the Catholic Church orders and so on, which give other sites. But we need to think of institutions that are in, partly not in the church. Okay, example, Tessé, not purely Catholic, but I mean, it gets Catholic sort of coloration, and even you might say dominant trend, but never Catholic. So it's the kind of place where people can come. And exactly this kind of encounter we really want can happen, right? So you ask the kid, you know, what are you looking for? You start from there and have a conversation. So we need to develop these kind of low-key places where this kind of thing can go on. And they may not be officially Catholic, and they have lots of non-Catholics. I think the church, the Église c'est nous, no, they don't say we are the church, that's also the church offering. And I think this is something that Thomas Halleck was saying, I think in the paper, or maybe you said it yesterday or something, we need this invention of these new kinds of places. Then, on the other side, we have this difficult issue of all these coexisting in the same church. And we get this tremendous conflict of outcomes that you have in the next priest king, right? I mean, some people think we have the truth.
Yeah.
And this, to me, existentially, it makes no sense at all. I mean, I have this Catholic faith, and I think that all this long process of following Christ and so on. Yeah, I'll get farther into the truth, but I don't have it now. It's just kind of absurd. Or I'm making this huge bet of my life on this being the direction.
Yeah.
So there's some sense of a direction here, but no sense of real content. I'm tremendously aware that if I do make this journey successfully, it'll be in some part due to conversations with people who don't share that direction. You know, you think of how we have learned institutionally, for instance, nonviolent resistance is something that a lot of us think is a very important part of our Christian faith. But we thanks to Gandhi. But I mean, it's not only thanks to Gandhi, because he also read the Bible, he also was influenced that there are, and goes Gandhi, Martin Luther King, now it's something that we think of in Christian terms. Think of how this happened. We were helped along on our journey by contact with all these other journeys. And I mean, I think that's the second, the open interpretation is the correct one. But so here we have, if you like, the truth we have, I think is a very, very good point. It's like the truth, the way, and the life. The way and the life are obviously processual concepts, right? And the truth is also processual. So all right, how do we, the big question, I don't have the answer, the big question we have to work on is how we can coexist with people that have that other attitude. How can we see, in a sense, how can we bring out in their lives the processuality that is really going on in their lives, right? And then we can meet on the same basis, but that's going to require a great deal of openness on our part, a great deal of humility, a great deal of letting them speak and so on. I can imagine getting to that point, but we're a long way from
Oh, yeah.
So these are questions that will haunt us for the next 48 hours.
Thanks very much for everyone. All contributions were obviously of great value to all of us. And of course, as you know, this conference is a process itself, so we have to work up now. And Joe will explain where our lunch is happening.
Okay, so thank you very much, Luis. So we are in the process. We are, and the main problem is finding direction. Fortunately, the direction now is very easy. So it's much easier than the direction we are trying to find in the global context of the world for the global church. I would suggest, because people maybe want to go to the bathrooms and so, that at 12:25 we are ready to leave at the front door of the university, the main door. There we, as you get out from the main door, we turn to the left, we walk for about 50 meters, and we stop. 50, 55, maybe 60. The restaurant is 2 minutes away, or less, from here. Lanterna. Okay, so, but I suggest that we go together around 12 to 25. We leave from that direction. Thank you.